Welcome to Digication Scholars Conversations. I'm your host, Jeff Yan. In this episode, you'll hear part one of the conversation with Jordi Getman from Bronx Community College. More links and information about today's conversation can be found on Digication's Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. Full episodes of Digication Scholars Conversations can be found on YouTube or your favorite podcast app. Welcome to Digication Scholars Conversations. Today we have Jordi Getman, Professor Jordi Getman here. Jordi and I actually met in December 2008. Did you know that?
I remember that. That is true.
A little over 12 years ago.
I know.
That's incredible.
Much younger. Our voices were still not sounding like adults, but
I think yours just after all of the whiskey that you've been drinking, that must be, you get a character in your
it,
voice now.
yes, but it is tequila. I want to correct you just
Oh,
to
it's
make
the
sure that we
tequila.
have the
Sorry
record
about
straight on that. Yeah.
that. Okay. Well, let me continue to tell people about you, Jordi. Jordi is a professor of history at Bronx Community College, part of the CUNY system, the City University of New York system, one of the actually largest urban public school systems, colleges in the United States. Jordi is also a consortial professor of history in the CUNY online baccalaureate program at the CUNY School of Professional Studies. And I should have looked this up before. Um,
Good.
we have looked up the episode. We have an episode already by another person at
At
CUNY
SPS.
SBS. Actually,
Mhm.
it's awesome. So we'll put a link onto that in the show notes after. Um, and Jordi has had so many roles. I'm not going to have time to go through all of them, but probably the main thing is you've been a coordinator of the e-portfolio program for a very long time now at Bronx. You were involved with honors program
Yeah,
at
I
one
created it
point.
before I created the portfolio program in 2008, 2009. After I met you, um, before that, I created an honors program at BCC because
That's right.
when I arrived there, I thought it was insulting that we didn't have a program that allowed our great students, and there's tons of them at BCC, to aspire to higher academic achievement. So yeah, and it's still running, which is good.
Yeah, it's amazing. And most recently, you also took on a huge effort into doing the middle states accreditation, and it was a super successful accreditation. I think that was in 2017 or 18.
That's when we started, but it ended in 2019, and
Yeah, that's right.
yeah, and interestingly enough, we received a commendation for our assessment practices, which I was quite surprised by. But it was nice to receive that commendation from Middle States. It's hard to get that one.
Yeah, it is, and congratulations on that. And then one more big congratulations on the 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 new thing that's coming up. You are the inaugural director of online learning at BCC.
That's true. Yeah, we've just applied for and have been approved for the development of online degree programs. And so we're going to start with liberal arts and sciences, and then we'll move on to other departments and other programs. The objective is, to take lessons learned from COVID and the forced movement online of a large portion of our faculty and our student population, and we've found that there's a relatively large percentage of our students who have shown interest now that they're have been exposed to online learning, um, have shown interest in the possibilities that it brings of being able to get a degree online, because their lives are very complicated, and they have a lot of there's not much time in their days. So
Yeah,
being able to avoid some of the transit times that would be required of going on campus. But beyond that, I think what's really interesting, and I hope we talk about this a little bit, is I was just looking at the some of the surveys we did last semester. The pedagogical elements that a lot of our faculty have developed in these new online courses that they've been forced to teach have been quite interesting. And a lot of the students have, we do have students who didn't find that to be very positive at all. But there's I'd say about 20 to, depending on where you look, about close to 30% of our students who really look now at online learning as something viable and positive and pedagogically sound. And that's a it says a lot about our faculty. But it also says about our students' adaptability, and I think it's natural. It's something that we haven't really been talking about much in the world of education. Our students have been online for a long time, so we're late. We're the ones that are late to the game. So I think it's interesting to delve into it head first and try to make something positive out of it for our students.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's great. It's so great that you're taking on this position, because for me, probably one of the things that I have enjoyed most about being a colleague of yours and a friend,
Hmm.
is it's your dedication to just student learning. I mean, there isn't there are I feel like a lot of professors have to worry a lot about, I don't know, everything from tenure and promotion to the politics to ego.
Sure.
But you tend to just throw all that away. Yours is all just 100% about student learning and innovation. Really, sort of trying to get some continuous improvement out of it.
I mean, it's funny because to say that I've been able to avoid all that it's just not. It's not true. There's politics and all the bureaucratic uh, obstacles that stand in the way of getting innovative ideas pushed through. Especially I mean, I don't know. I've never worked for a private institution, at least education wise. So I wouldn't know how that would work out there. But certainly with public educational institutions, it's very difficult to get new innovative ideas pushed through and accepted as something that could become part of not just a little experiment on the side, but actually become institutionalized and an integral element of how education and student support is developed. And at that level, I have to say, there's a natural element of mine that always looks for something, um, something better. It doesn't matter what I'm looking at. I'm always looking like, how can we improve the process, just in general in life. But when I got to BCC back in 2003, you know, Bronx Community College had way too many people. Faculty are incredibly dedicated to the students, but there were way too many people in administration and even in the faculty who were somewhat condescending towards the students and not really. There are a lot of stereotypes that were established on their academic ability, how well prepared or not prepared they were. I mean, obviously, our students, most of them come from you know uh, economically difficult situations. They don't have family or friends who have attended college. They don't really have that sort of point of reference of what it's like to be a college student or what it's required of you. So it's difficult to teach in a sense because you're trying to like bring them on board to an experience that they don't really have a reference for. Um, but I personally found that there were many like mental and cultural obstacles to looking at our students for who they are and not who we think they are. And so to me, that's always been part of who I am as a person. I don't look at someone and stereotype them. I mean, maybe it's because I'm an immigrant to this country and English is not my first language. I I'm always very careful to try to listen before I speak. And at that level, it's really important to listen to our students. And the moment that I have to admit, the first few years, I thought I was doing, I thought I was a good teacher. I thought that I was actually reaching my students by being a good lecturer and telling a good story. Good historians tell good stories, and I was developing the narrative for them, and I was, you know, including them into that narrative. But it was the moment, about 3 years in, that I kind of stopped and started listening to my students more actively. That I realized that maybe I wasn't as good a teacher as I thought I was, because I wasn't really including them. Maybe I was even being somewhat condescending by thinking that I knew where they were coming from. And so at that level, it's interesting because as a historian, one of the things that we really, in the discipline, that we really stress is the notion of context. You
Mhm.
can't just look at, a piece of text written 200 years ago and just evaluate it in the present. You have to think about the context of where of the event that it came out of, or the time in which it was written. You can't really look at opinions from 200 years ago and think that you know exactly where they were coming from. And so if you apply that, I started thinking, if I apply that to my students' background and their point of view, um, then I can use context in a very positive way, not just in an academic research
Mhm.
context, but in a pedagogical context. And it was a huge step forward for me. Um, it really changed how I've taught ever since. I've never looked back. I can't even imagine going back to a moment where I just spoke at my students, which is what I was doing. Really well, I guess. They could replicate every detail of my lectures and final exams,
Yeah.
and I felt good about that for a while. But then I realized it was about me, not about them. So once you change that mindset, I think,
Yeah.
and Bronx Community College allows that to happen because we are in need to help students succeed. Um, it's a very difficult mission for all of us,
Yeah.
for the faculty, for administrators, and for the students.
Jordy, that just reminded me that. And by the way, thanks for sharing that, because I think is that you said that you also have to deal with the bureaucracy and all that, and I think you're right, but I think it's the courage that you are willing to face it and not get beaten down by it. You're continuing to just innovate regardless. And one of the things that I remember I was so moved by is you gave this presentation. It must have been at AAC and and I think you and Kate
Mhm,
Koken,
mhm.
um, Professor Kate Koken. I hope to get her to be on this show at some point too, because she's
You should.
amazing.
She's amazing.
Um, uh, I I think I think the two of you gave this presentation, and you were starting to experiment with the idea of having students having discourses over in historical texts,
Mhm.
um,
Yeah.
and and as a way to start to sort of learn from each other, and start to sort of have their own background, like you said, comes out because in their conversations. You want to talk about that because you're going to have a much better
Yeah.
way to explain it, and I think that that speaks a little bit to the kind of innovative approach that you have for the students.
Yeah. I think it's interesting because I would argue, there's always been there always is a sort of separation between the personal domain, like who we are as people, students, let's say, who they are, and the academic domain. So, like, um, when students come onto campus, they walk into a different world in their mind and physically and mentally. And that's always been, I mean, I would argue that that's always the case. But in the case of BCC, that the boundary between the personal and the academic is much more marked because they don't have an academic reference. A lot of them don't. And so there's a lot of difficulty getting them to cross over. And when they do, a lot of them are actually afraid of bringing with them their personal domain, who they are as a person. So there's so much that they have experienced in life, and yet, and it's taught them a lot about how to behave with others, where they fit in society. There's definitely I would even argue an intellectual dimension to it that they don't recognize sometimes they have, but they're incredibly smart. Um, and so rather than uh, sort of try to directly connect that, like transfer that over to the academic realm, I started realizing some years ago that there's a great empowering element to bringing the personal into the academic. And so what you're talking about, this is something that once Digication, which we've used since I met you in 2008, and I had looked at other. It's funny because I, I don't want this to sound like a commercial in any way, but the moment I met you, Jeff, I saw that same desire to not just be complacent and to like always move forward. And so that was really important to us to decide to use Digication as a platform, because we wanted something that was always on the edge of creativity. It was always pushing the boundaries. And so the moment that Digication made it possible for users to comment on specific lines of text, it just immediately, I thought, as a historian, rather than sitting in a classroom with a piece of paper in front of you and like everybody reading at the same time, and then people raising their hand and making comments about what they were reading, these historical texts, primary sources, why not have the students engage in that text analysis before they came to class, so that rather than guide them through textual analysis in the classroom, do that the first couple of times, but then after that, just let them loose and have them engage in textual analysis on their own at home, but on the same e-portfolio page. So it's asynchronous, but at the same time, all students are commenting and engaging with each other on the same page. And I'm not part of that. I'm not the instigator. I've provided them a text, I've provided them the context, and then they engage in analyzing the significance of certain parts of the text, so that rather than guide them towards a specific phrase and say, this is the important one that you have to pay attention to, which is much more traditional, I would argue. I mean, that's how I was raised and then how I went through college and even grad school. Um, it's been fascinating to allow them to like dig and find relevancy in the text, and it really helps. And just to backtrack for a second, in developing their notion of context. So initially, the first couple of weeks, they feel uncomfortable, they don't know how to analyze these texts, but by the third week or the fourth week, we do it throughout the semester. It's 14 weeks of textual analysis. By the time they get to the end of it, their ability to really point to and understand context, intentionality, intended audience, all of this really is a well developed skill. And what's fascinating to me is that I'm basically giving away the secrets that you have to traditionally wait till grad school to learn.
Mhm.
Like this is what the epistemological elements or sort of
Yeah.
structure of history as a discipline, but they're engaging in it as freshmen, first year students, second year students in college, in a way that it- when I was that age, all I got was the storyline, the narrative.
Right.
I had to wait to do the analysis. So, but to be honest with you, that's all online now. Like the narrative is online. You can just I have videos. They can listen to my video or watch my video, and 15-minute video, give them the context, and then they go in and they analyze. And you know what? In this day and age, information literacy, the ability to understand what is and what is not a good source and what the intended meaning of that source is critical. I mean, the political, cultural reality that we live today, not just in this country but around the world, is needs that.
So you covered so much there, and I want to go back to you talking about um, this idea of these first or second year, or equivalent to first or second year students, are doing much higher level work almost after these 14 weeks. And I just love that because, all it took is for a professor to not underestimate the the intellectual capacity of these students. And these students, um, from what I have learned over the years, otherwise sometimes they would feel like they're the underdogs. They felt like that you know, um, they are, they got dealt a bad hand, and this is it's a difficult time for them. But I think this is where I think education becomes so incredible. And speaking of that kind of, um, the ability for you to link them to the academic, and maybe to a certain extent we can talk about things like, um, literacy skills and analytical skills, critical thinking skills, and ability to ask questions. But I also think that there is a huge amount of just confidence building and believing in yourself that actually as academics we don't talk about. Like, that's not really in anyone's learning outcomes.
I couldn't agree with you more. It's tremendously. Um, I mean, I was mentioning when I had that moment of realization when I just saw that what I was doing as a teacher was not serving my students. I was serving my own ego as a professor. And so the moment I switched over and started really concentrating on what it was what I could do to reach them, on their terms, and a lot of people, I get criticized by some of my own colleagues in my own department about not being about lowering my standards. The fact that I don't actually engage my students in like all the content that needs to be covered in the class. And the reality is that for me, this is much more complicated to actually help to develop metacognitive, analytical skills in my students is so much more relevant than having them be able to recite content, like the narrative, the historical narrative. So at that level, you know, I I long stopped caring about what they think. I think my students, what they think is much more relevant, and to have them be able to feel, you said a key word, confident. Um, in an academic structure that has traditionally been so hierarchical, and where I as a professor am going to be, what traditionally would be the gatekeeper of knowledge. Um, Mm, that's I'm sure that makes a lot of people feel good to have that degree of recognition, but it doesn't really help the students because it puts them in this long line, this long waiting line that they have to go through to get to a point of feeling like they actually know something. There are way too many obstacles, and our students at Bronx Community College don't have that time. That coming to BCC for many of them is the last train of hope. Like they want to make a better life for themselves, and most of them come in thinking that they need a better job, and that's why they're there. They'll tell you that I need a better paying job, but that's not what I'm not there to give them a degree that'll give them a few more thousand a year. It's much more powerful to have them become confident in their academic knowledge, their ability to engage their peers, to become leaders. All of that is integral to what we do. A lot of the faculty at BCC do, which is to actually turn to the student and build that confidence. And with once you do that, it's interesting because I've taught history classes. I've also taught the first year seminar that we developed a few years ago, with this very notion of confidence building in mind. And it's fascinating to see students who also, just like I as a teacher, had that moment where I clicked and said, "Oh wow, I've been doing this all wrong." The moment they overcome the notion that they're inferior, because society has made them feel inferior for a long time. The moment they gain that confidence, it's wonderful to see where they go. I mean, I saw that with the honors program. You know, Columbia University and NYU every year were calling me asking for more students to transfer. with full scholarships, because the level of intellectual engagement that our students, once they gain that confidence, were able to offer is well beyond anything stale like you would find in a lot of privileged schools. So yeah, I think that for us, and you know what, it's a mindset that is required of faculty to be able to do that well. You can't just say, "Oh, here's the formula, and I'm gonna, engage my students in, student-centered learning." It really does require sitting down and rethinking very seriously how you teach, and it takes a while. It takes years to really feel like you're actually getting it right. So it's not something that's automatic. It's not something that's quick and easy. And that's actually something that we've been engaging our faculty in is they've had to switch over to online teaching because of COVID, and a lot of them are frustrated with what the obstacles that they're finding in trying to transfer. They're trying to transfer who they were as teachers to this new modality, and it's a whole different world. So I'm actually trying to use COVID as, in a sense, as a leverage point to have faculty reevaluate not just going from face to face to online, but rather to go from a more traditional manner of instruction to one in which you really immerse yourself in engaging the students um, at the level we've been talking about.
Mhm. And I've been this is fascinating as you to hear you talk about this sort of confidence building, and it's about creating opportunities. And Biden is now saying possibilities, for them, um, in in ways a lot beyond getting that degree or even getting the grades, for that semester. And I think that sometimes, you know students, when you are, on the day-to-day teaching class or taking a class, that's what all that mattered, and that's not true. And I've been, in fact, looking recently at this idea of a have you heard of this thing called a global social mobility index? And it's a
Yes.
yeah, it's kind of like this, almost like measuring the upward mobility, sort of probability for people. And it certainly take into account, some, especially when it takes into account the different school districts that you attended, the different zip codes where you live. it United States so far, we've done a really poor job. Just as a reference, I just looked it up, and now this is Wikipedia level, information. So please don't quote me on this, but just to get a sense, the top five countries are all Nordic countries. They are scoring at about 85 ish,
Hmm.
80 something, 85. Number one in Denmark, and number two Norway, 83 out of 100. United States comes at ranking at 27 at 70. Um, it really speaks to there's a big gap really between that. It and when I look at that, and by the way, this is on average. This is like we're taking, we're not, if we take the, if we were able to look specifically at areas where, for example, at Bronx, I bet you the percentage is way lower. So it's a big problem that we need to address, in education. Um,
Yeah, and it's fascinating you say that, because as I mentioned, I'm an immigrant to this country, and I moved when I was 9 to a small rural town in Arkansas, and attended public school there. And I have to tell you that the sort of the dialogue is really centered a lot on inner city schools and the difficulties of big cities. But I went to middle school and high school in this small town, and it the level of underachievement um, on the part of the institutions was incredible. So that students were not challenged, and they weren't supported, and they weren't helped along, and it was a white town too. So you talk about minorities. there's a huge, for me, more than talking about race or ethnicity, and I mean there are obviously huge issues with that, and we've been having to like face them head on, and I'm glad we are in the last couple of years. But I'll tell you right now, part of the big problem with this country is that rural communities are just not engaged in any. There's no real concern on the part of local school boards with the student education in a sort of significant manner. And so you end up having these great divides between students who have received or privileged education and those who haven't. And unfortunately, there's a huge percentage of our population that has not received the privileged education because of the way our system is set up. You're talking about Scandinavia. They've had a long tradition of inclusive educational structures, mainly public, to the point that even if you have a lot of money, I mean, you might not find the need to go to a private school
Yep.
because the
Everyone
public
goes
ones
to
are
the same schools. Yeah.
yeah.
Mhm.
And that's a huge difference.
Yep.
And so
And
for
I
me,
know.
just let me say that for me, and I've been dedicated to public education since the beginning, um, because my grandmother had a third grade education, but she worked her whole life 7 days a week so that her daughters could go to not just high school but college. And it represented such a huge shift in where my family, and look at me now, I have a doctorate, and I'm teaching history. But to me, my grandmother is who I think about. I go back. I came to a place like Bronx Community College because I'm dedicated to helping that jump occur. If we don't if we don't help students who are underprivileged be able to catch up, then there's always going to be this deep divide. So we have to institutionally work to help them be able to come up to meet the intellectual potential that they really do have. Too many years they've been told that they're underachievers, that they're never going to get there, that they might as well just get used to it. But you know what impresses me every day? They don't want to believe that, and they're fighters. And we have to respond to them and answer their call.
This concludes part 1 of our conversation with Jordi Getman from Bronx Community College. To hear part 2, be sure to subscribe to Digication Scholars Conversations on YouTube, iTunes, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app. Digication Scholars Conversations is brought to you by Digication, a technology platform powering the most innovative e-portfolio programs in K-12 and higher education. Our website can be found at digication.com. This episode was produced by Drew Albanesius and Jessica Chittum. Thanks for listening.